Watch this. A security camera angle from above a fluorescent ICU catches three men in dark tactical vests stepping through the double doors. They move with purpose. One of them calls out a name. Jerome Baptist. For a breathless second, the room freezes. That single name unravels everything the staff in that unit had been holding together. Fragile lives, split-second decisions, a trust cultivated between patient and caregiver. What follows is not the quiet, clinical response anyone expects when federal agents enter a hospital. It becomes something else entirely. A human blockade, a moral line drawn by nurses in scrubs and shoes, and a confrontation that will ripple far beyond the walls of St. Mary's. If this story matters to you, subscribe and stay with us. Because this is about how the people who care for us became the ones who saved one of their own. Jerome Baptist had not always planned to be at the center of a national conversation. Born in Haiti, he came to the United States as a young man, and like so many who choose healthcare, poured himself into work that asks for more than just technical skill. He trained as an intensive care nurse, a role that demands constant attention, quick judgment, and a kind of quiet courage. He became a naturalized citizen. He carried the paperwork that proved that citizenship. A passport, an I-9, records in the hospital's employment verification system. In the ICU, he was known for an even temper and methodical hands. Colleagues called him steady. On the morning the footage begins, Jerome was assigned to a 12-bed unit, where two patients were critically ill. One was a 43-year-old woman admitted with septic shock, a life-threatening response to infection that required constant monitoring and titration of medications. Machines beeped rhythms that everyone in that room knew by sound, the beep of a heart holding on, the lower tone of an infusion pump delivering a drug that cannot be interrupted without consequence. Continuity of care in that environment is not an abstract idea. It is something measured in minutes, in who hands off to whom, in the confidence that the person at the bedside will stay present. When the agents pushed through the doors, the clinical choreography of that morning stuttered. Morrison, later identified in recordings as the lead agent, stepped forward and said he had a warrant naming Jerome. He did not whisper. He did not ask whether anyone present could confirm the man's identity or role. He spoke with the authority of federal power in plain English. This is the man we are here for. The reaction inside the unit was immediate and instinctive. Patricia Reeves, the charge nurse on duty that day, moved physically between the agents and her staff. She planted herself in the space where they would have to come through to reach Jerome. With her was Dr. Helena Kim, an attending physician and an immigrant herself, who took the warrant and read it aloud to the room. The language was clinical in its own way, an administrative warrant. Those words matter. An administrative warrant, unlike a judicial arrest warrant, does not automatically authorize on-the-spot removals. It allows for questioning, for verification. It is not, in most circumstances, a license to take someone from a sensitive location like a hospital without additional judicial authorization. Patricia's stance was not a stunt. It was a deliberate, professional choice rooted in hospital policy and patient safety. Nurses in that ICU had a protocol for outside presence, who could enter, when, and under what circumstances. The hospital's legal counsel and HR had procedures meant to protect patients' privacy and well-being. HIPAA considerations, the hospital explained, were not merely boxes to check. They were obligations. The room itself was a sensitive location where moving a caregiver away from critically ill patients could mean immediate danger. That realization refocused the encounter. The agents shifted tactics. They read sections of the administrative warrant aloud and insisted they had authority to question and verify a person's status. "This isn't a judicial warrant," one of them conceded on camera. "It gives us authority to question him and verify his status. Maybe in a public space, not in a hospital." Those words landed like a legal puzzle on the unit floor. Who decides what counts as a public space? What counts as interference with patient care? Nurse after nurse stepped into the space. Not one dramatic hero. Not a single person acting alone. 8 nurses eventually formed a tight human wall in front of the nurses' station and the room where Jerome stood. They linked shoulders. They positioned themselves between the agents and the patient care zones. Their faces were firm. Their voices were steady and saturated with the particular clarity that comes from experience. You're not touching him. You're not questioning him. You're not taking him anywhere. Those words, captured on footage that would later spread online, are spare and simple. They are also legal and ethical resolve made audible. They were a protection for Jerome, yes. They were also protection for the patients whose lives would be suspended if a primary caregiver was removed mid-shift. For almost an hour, accounts say 30 to 60 minutes, the room held in an unusual way. It held the threat of federal authority and the practical requirements of bedside care. It held the tension between a paper document and a living, breathing clinical reality. Hospital security personnel came to the doorway and observed. HR representatives and a hospital lawyer arrived and began to confer with the nursing leadership. The unit manager logged the scene. A physician balanced the bedside tasks against the need to preserve human dignity and procedural correctness. The agents continued to assert their instructions, and Patricia, Dr. Kim, and the other nurses continued to insist on process. What was at stake in those minutes was more than Jerome's legal status. It was the trust between patients and the people charged with keeping them alive. It was the legal principle that certain sites, courts, schools, places of worship, and hospitals have special protections from certain kinds of enforcement actions unless stricter judicial oversight exists. It was also the professional judgment of people who had trained to care for the most vulnerable and had every reason to believe that removing a nurse in the middle of critical care could cause immediate harm. Part of the problem as it unfolded was not mysterious. It was human and bureaucratic. The agents were operating off a name match pulled from a database. They had not fully verified Jerome's date of birth, employment records, or citizenship documentation before arriving at the unit. In discovery later, the lawsuit would allege that the verification was minimal, a red flag many experts say should have stopped the action before it began. In the moment, what the room could see was not the paperwork in the database. It was the man at the station, his badge pinned to his scrub top, his calm voice as he explained where he'd be and who his patients were. Jerome's hands shook at one point, catching a nurse's attention. He later told counsel and the press that his fear was bound up with more than the possibility of detention. He had built a life here, he said. Citizenship, a professional reputation, the quiet knowledge of how to hold lines in a crisis. The possibility of being taken away from it without due cause felt like being stripped of identity and security all at once. The footage shows Dr. Kim holding the administrative warrant and reading it aloud, not as an act of confrontation, but as an act of checking. The hospital's counsel asked the agents whether they had considered verifying employment through E-Verify or consulting the HR records in the office down the hall. When the agents said they had a name matched to federal records, the hospital pointed to the more concrete documents in Jerome's personnel file. Jerome's passport was visible in registration logs. His I-9 had been completed on hiring. The disagreement, in short, was not about whether the agents had a piece of paper. It was about whether that piece of paper, in that setting, gave them the right to remove a nurse from an active ICU without judicial authorization. As the minutes stretched, the emotional tone of the unit hardened into a form of solidarity that was both practical and moral. Nurses held positions that allowed other nurses to continue their work. The person whose job was to take over the infusion pump stayed at the patient's bedside until a new handoff was arranged. Dr. Kim continued to attend to the clinically urgent, delegating tasks with a steady voice. Each small decision in the room was a choice to preserve the immediate safety of patients and the dignity of their staff. One of the things that stands out in the recordings is how ordinary the people look in the midst of extraordinary circumstances. They are not uniformed protesters. They are not legal scholars reciting statutes. They are nurses, scrubs, hair tied back, stethoscopes looped over shoulders. That ordinariness is part of its power. The human wall was not scripted. It followed the logic of proximate care. You do not allow an interruption when lives hang in the balance. Outside the unit, the situation was already following another path. Some staff snapped cell phone videos. Others whispered to colleagues. The hallways, usually measured in routine and charting, felt smaller. The hospital's incident reporting system began to populate entries. That documentation would matter later. So would the exact times captured on surveillance footage. Timestamps that would show who entered when, who left, where conversations occurred. The surveillance video did not capture motives, but it did capture actions. It did not capture intent, but it did create an irrefutable record of what physically transpired in real time. When the agents finally stepped back, whether because of questioning from legal counsel, the presence of security personnel, or the clarity of hospital policy, the unit exhaled. It exhaled because the immediate physical threat to Jerome was relaxed. It exhaled because the patients who had been breathing against sepsis and failure were still being attended. But the exhale did not erase the aftermath. Jerome would later describe a lasting anxiety that followed him like a shadow. Colleagues who had formed that wall would later recount the moral clarity they felt. A professional oath made literal in a circle of bodies between authority and a caregiver. The video that captured those minutes did something more than preserve memory. Once clips made it online, the story leapt from internal emails to public conversation. Viewers saw a group of healthcare workers stand between federal agents and a black Haitian-American nurse whose citizenship documents were in order. They heard, in the most direct way, the nurses say, "You're not touching him. You're not questioning him. You're not taking him anywhere." Those phrases, simple and declarative, became a viral shorthand for workplace solidarity. Public reaction was swift. Healthcare professionals across the country shared the footage. Nursing organizations queried hospital procedures and published guidance about protecting staff and patients in sensitive locations. Editors and legal academics began to parse the distinction between administrative and judicial processes. For many viewers, the image of colleagues forming a protective ring against enforcement agents crystallized a question about the limits of federal power and the rights of workers on the job. Within days of the incident, Jerome consulted with David Wu, an immigration attorney who would later take his case. Their initial conversations centered on the same two threads that defined the ICU confrontation: the procedural flaws in how the agents operated, and the emotional, professional harm inflicted on a nurse who had been doing his job. Jerome's desire was not purely punitive. He wanted accountability, yes, but he also wanted to ensure that no other caregiver would face the same sudden threat in a place meant to be safe for healing. The decision to pursue legal action is one that often follows a calculus, as much emotional as legal. For Jerome, the calculus included the public record captured in that surveillance footage, the medical necessity of continuity of care that had been interrupted, and the documentation in his personnel file that did not match the basis of the agent's claim. For his colleagues, the decision to speak about what they had seen came with the risk of professional scrutiny. Nurses do not go looking for headlines, but many felt that the moral imperative to tell the truth, to preserve a public record of what happened in that unit, outweighed personal hesitation. That action, posting video, giving testimony, contacting counsel, is what turned a tense hour in a hospital hallway into the beginning of a case that would test the balance between institutional protections and federal enforcement methods. The surveillance footage, once it left the hospital network and entered the wider public domain, became both archive and evidence. It allowed viewers, jurors, and policy observers to see the sequence of events without relying solely on conflicting narratives. In litigation, such recordings are often decisive because they remove the fog of memory and place the dispute into frames of time and motion. But before the cameras moved the story into courtrooms and policy debates, there were immediate human costs to reckon with. Jerome, the nurses, and the patients all carried with them the residue of that hour. Patients reported later, in the limited and careful way allowed by medical confidentiality, feeling unsettled by the presence of uniformed agents in the ward. Staff members spoke of sleepless nights and the sudden re-examination of what safe space meant within a hospital. Administrators convened meetings to review response protocols. Questions proliferated. Had the agents followed proper verification steps? Had hospital protocols been properly communicated or enforced? Who would be accountable if the verification failed to prevent an unjustified detainment? The nurse's action had immediate practical benefits. Jerome continued to care for his patients that day. He stayed on shift. The infusion pumps did not pause mid-titration. The monitoring alarms kept their measure. But the scene also raised larger concerns. It forced the hospital to confront its own vulnerability to outside actors and to ask whether existing procedures were sufficient to protect both staff and patients from the consequences of bureaucratic errors. None of this happened in a vacuum. The episode at St. Mary's echoed broader national anxieties about immigration enforcement intersecting with everyday life. For communities of immigrants, the sight of federal agents sweeping into institutions where safety and trust are paramount reverberated with historical memory and current worry. For healthcare workers, it raised urgent questions about the sanctity of clinical spaces and the protections required to ensure uninterrupted care. And yet, at the center of the footage is an intimate and abiding human scene. A circle of nurses, shoulder to shoulder, declaring aloud in unambiguous language that they would not allow an on-the-spot removal of a colleague. The words they spoke were legal and moral both. You're not touching him. You're not questioning him. You're not taking him anywhere. They spoke not only for Jerome, but for the patients whose lives depended on the stability of that moment. What comes next is a path the footage itself does not decide. It will wind through internal investigations, legal filings, and public debate. But the first act is clear and simple. A group of healthcare workers, faced with the prospect of a colleague's abrupt removal from a critical care environment, chose to protect him and the patients in their charge. The choice was ordinary and extraordinary at once. Ordinary in its instinctive professional care, extraordinary in the way it confronted federal authority and turned a legal question into a bedside defense. As the video traveled beyond the hospital, it began to gather additional forms of documentation, timestamps, witness statements, log entries. Those would become the scaffolding for later claims about procedural failures by enforcement agents and for Jerome's decision to seek legal redress. But the human footage, the raw grain of that hour, would remain the core, a sequence of actions that any juror, any policymaker, or any member of the public could watch and interpret. By the time news organizations reached out to the hospital and to Jerome, the narrative had already bifurcated into two primary threads. One thread focused on legal distinctions and procedural correctness. What does an administrative warrant permit, and what does it not? The other thread focused on moral clarity. Why did nurses feel compelled to interpose themselves? Both threads would be essential. Both would be argued fiercely. Within the hospital, administrators began to sketch out an immediate response. Internal reviews were ordered. Legal counsel reviewed the sequence of events against hospital policy. Human resources circulated reminders about documentation. The chief medical officer requested a full account from the unit manager. For many of those administrators, the job was not simply to defend the hospital's legal position. It was to restore trust among staff and patients, to show that hospital leadership would stand behind clinicians who followed policies that prioritized patient safety. For Jerome, the episode did something he would describe later as a fracturing of a settled life. He had always identified as a nurse first, a person who shows up for patients. The possibility that a name match in a federal database, a clerical error, an unverified record, could upend that identity was destabilizing in ways that were visceral and practical. He began to worry about what it would mean for his career, his family, and his community, if the episode were to hang over him in bureaucratic limbo. His colleagues, meanwhile, were not thinking of history or headlines. They were thinking of the 43-year-old woman with septic shock whose blood pressure depended on continuous medication adjustments. They were thinking of the next shift and the moral responsibility of staying present, the decision to stand, to link up in front of a nurse's station, to refuse passively to allow the agents to proceed. That decision saved not only Jerome's job in that moment, but possibly a patient's life. The footage that captured that decision also captured small, telling details. The angle of a nurse's hand on a chart, a badge glinting under fluorescent light, the agent's pause when met with a line of bodies. The camera does not tell us all motivations, but it shows choices. Those images would later be replayed, dissected, and litigated. For now, they were a record of a day when courage, in its quiet occupational form, stopped an immediate wrong. As the unit returned to its normal cadence, the alarms, the rounds, the subdued conversations, the knowledge that the hospital stand had prevented a removal did not erase the questions that remained. The agents had left with their warrant and their claims. The hospital had preserved its staff and patients. The footage had been recorded. The next steps, which would carry the incident from an internal crisis to a legal contest, were beginning to take shape. Lawyers were contacted. Witnesses began to collect statements. The community around St. Mary's started to ask, in public forums and private conversations, what protections exist for healthcare workers and their patients when enforcement agencies conduct operations based on imperfect data. The story that began with 3 agents walking into a critical care unit and calling out a name had become, within hours, a test case about mercy, procedure, and the limits of power. The nurses who stood in the doorway that day, led by Patricia Reeves and supported by Dr. Helena Kim and others, knew then what would later be described in legal filings and news columns. Their action was not merely symbolic. It was a line of defense drawn out of obligation and conscience. Those minutes in the ICU, frozen on camera, would go on to shape not just the legal strategies that followed, but the way healthcare workers across the country thought about protecting patients and colleagues. The human barrier that day was, for many, a blueprint, a reminder that solidarity in a workplace is not merely rhetorical. It is practical, enforceable, and sometimes the difference between uninterrupted care and immediate harm. What the footage did not show, what no camera could capture, was the slow, accumulating weight of fear that followed Jerome. Even after the agents left, he found himself replaying the incident, thinking about the worst-case scenarios: detention, separation, the loss of professional standing. He also felt gratitude, a complicated gratitude toward colleagues who had risked confrontation to preserve his role and protect the patients. That gratitude would later be expressed in many forms: interviews, courtroom testimony, and quiet conversations on the unit. As the outside world began to react, the hospital faced a new set of pressures. Public statements had to balance respect for federal agencies with a clear restatement of hospital policy and commitment to patient safety. Internal communications had to reassure staff that reporting and protective mechanisms were in place. Faces in the ICU that had been focused on immediate clinical tasks were now called upon to recount their actions in a way that would enter the public record. The story, then, was moving from the immediate scene to the structural questions that the footage surfaced. How did a name in a database escalate to federal agents entering a hospital? What verification steps were followed? Who would be responsible if those steps were insufficient? And most importantly, what does it mean when the people charged with upholding public safety arrive with incomplete information at the point of care? Those questions would be answered in part by documentation, timestamps, personnel files, electronic employment verifications. They would also be answered by testimony, the statements of nurses, physicians, security staff, and eventually the agents themselves. For now, however, the footage was the primary archive. It offered a simple, irrefutable sequence. 3 agents enter, a name is spoken, a human wall forms, the agents are halted. When Jerome and his counsel began to consider legal action, they did so with that footage as the backbone of their claim. It would allow them to show not only that the agents had acted, but how they had acted, and how the nurses' response had meaningfully prevented harm. That would be crucial in any legal argument about constitutional violations, professional harms, and the damage caused by the agent's procedural failures. But those legal arguments would come later. For the moment, the footage had done what footage often does. It made the intangible visible. It made the moment per se available for public appraisal. And so the first chapter of this story, the one that begins with 3 agents stepping into an ICU and naming a nurse, closes on a different kind of opening. The human wall held. Jerome stayed at his post. The machines continued to beep. Colleagues formed a protective ring that, in the raw footage, becomes a lesson about duty and solidarity. Yet the concerns that prompted that ring had only just begun to be examined. The next steps, the decision to pursue accountability through the courts, the formal collection of evidence, and the surge of public attention, were now swelling on the horizon, waiting to be translated from urgent moral action into a legal narrative that would test the limits of enforcement and the power of recorded truth. What followed unfolded in 2 arenas at once: the courtroom and the court of public opinion. The surveillance footage that had been a grainy, undeniable account of an ICU hour became the central exhibit in a case that would hinge on process, verification, and the meaning of a hospital as a protected space. Jerome filed a federal lawsuit with the help of David Wu, alleging constitutional violations and seeking redress for the emotional and professional harms he suffered. The complaint framed the core claims precisely: that agents had acted beyond the limited authority of an administrative warrant, that their failure to verify basic identifying details before confronting a caregiver in a sensitive location violated Jerome's Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable seizures, and that the actions caused severe emotional distress and professional harm. The legal pleadings stayed careful to label constitutional contentions as allegations. The scene in the video, however, would speak in images that lawyers on both sides had to reckon with. Discovery peeled back the mechanics of the agent's operation. Internal ICE records showed the action had been initiated from a database hit, a name match that on paper seemed to track. But the documentary record produced in Discovery raised flags. Minimal cross-checking of date of birth and employment records, no attempt to contact hospital HR or review Jerome's personnel file before the field operation, and a superficial reliance on a name pulled from federal records. Depositions of supervisory agents confirmed that verification steps were near the minimums required by office practice in that region at the time. In court filings, Jerome's team argued that those minimal steps were grossly insufficient, given the potential consequences of a mistaken identity in a hospital. Nurses and hospital staff provided testimony that was at once clinical and moral. Patricia Reeves described, under oath, the split-second calculations she and her colleagues made when federal agents appeared in their unit. Her sworn account repeated the words many had already heard in the footage. "You're not touching him. You're not questioning him. You're not taking him anywhere." She explained how those statements and the physical positioning behind the nurse's station were not improvisational theater, but an application of professional responsibility, protecting patient care and following hospital policy that treated the ICU as a sensitive location. Dr. Helena Kim's deposition offered the legal frame. She had read the administrative warrant aloud to the room, and when counsel later compared that warrant to standard judicial warrants, she testified to the difference. "This isn't a judicial warrant," an agent had said on camera, a phrase that came to the forefront in courtroom argument as counsel parsed the scope of an administrative warrant. Authority to question and verify, yes. Authority to remove from a sensitive healthcare setting without judicial authorization, no. Jerome's immigration documents, his passport, his completed I-9, employment verification in the hospital's E-Verify records, were entered into evidence. HR staff testified that those files were the result of standard hiring procedures and that Jerome's records showed naturalized citizenship. The hospital's legal counsel produced incident reports and timestamps from surveillance feeds. Those time-coded images rendered actions and pauses unambiguous. Who entered, when they paused at the nurse's station, how long the nurses maintained the human barrier. As one legal observer later put it, the footage replaced arguments about memory with a frame-by-frame accounting of human choices. At trial, the juxtaposition of footage and testimony created a sequence that jurors could see and hear as much as imagine. Nurses spoke about the impact on patient safety if Jerome had been removed mid-shift. A nurse who had been covering the infusion pump recounted how continuity of care was maintained precisely because of the collective decision to keep Jerome at the bedside. A patient's testimony, careful, limited, and respectful of confidentiality, confirmed that uniformed agents in the ward disturbed the clinical environment. Administrators explained how policies are meant to protect staff and patients, and legal counsel described the hospital's reliance on those policies to keep clinical work uninterrupted. Morrison, the lead agent identified in footage, appeared in court filings and depositions. The agent's defense leaned on the distinction between administrative and criminal processes. Their presence, they argued, had been to question and verify actions that fall within authorized enforcement practice. But the plaintiff's team countered that the operational choice to confront a named individual in a sensitive care area without prior verification, or without first seeking judicial authorization where removal was the foreseeable outcome, violated protocol and constitutional safeguards. Expert witnesses helped translate agency practice into standards of reasonableness. A former ICE supervisor described typical verification steps that prudent officers should take before undertaking an in-field operation in a hospital. An employment verification specialist explained how E-Verify, passports, and I-9 paperwork provide clear indicators of employment and immigration status when properly consulted. A legal scholar testified about the special status of hospitals and the expectations that enforcement actions there be circumscribed by extra safeguards. The cumulative effect of these expert inputs placed the agent's conduct in a context that emphasized procedural caution, which jurors were told had been lacking. Throughout the trial, the surveillance footage retained its primacy. It did what documentary evidence often does. It narrowed contested narratives into visible actions. The sequence of entry, the speaking of Jerome's name, the formation of the human wall, and the agent's pauses were all seen without relying solely on recollection. In deliberation, jurors repeatedly returned to the video. They considered whether the agent's minimally documented verification could justify the disruption of patient care and a confrontation in a sensitive location. The verdict confirmed what many who watched the footage had suspected. After deliberation, the jury found the agents liable on the constitutional claims brought in Jerome's suit. The jury awarded $14 million in total damages, divided between compensatory awards that addressed Jerome's emotional and professional harm, and punitive damages intended to mark the gravity of the misconduct. In the courtroom moments that followed, Jerome, his counsel, and the nurses who had testified showed a range of emotion: relief, acknowledgement of the long legal road behind them, and a sober recognition that the ruling did not erase the trauma of the day. The consequences that flowed from the trial were not only financial. The recorded record and the jury's decision prompted an internal reckoning within the enforcement agency. Supervisory reviews led to discipline for certain field officers connected to the operation. In some accounts, supervisors and agents were reassigned or removed from similar duties as a result of the findings and the agency's own internal assessments. Importantly, the agency announced new verification requirements in the wake of the case. Updated guidance required more robust pre-operation checks when enforcement activities touched sensitive locations, including closer consultation with supervisory legal counsel, and clearer thresholds for when judicial authorization must be sought before attempted removal. Those procedural changes, documented in internal memos and public statements, reflected the judgment that minimal verification should not be the default where the stakes, patient stability, and a caregiver's liberty were so high. Hospitals and nursing organizations also took the case as a stimulus to act. St. Mary's undertook a comprehensive review of its own policies. Administrators instituted clearer protocols for how to document encounters with law enforcement, how to escalate questions about warrants, and how to protect patient care when external parties insist on access. Nursing associations circulated the ICU scene as a cautionary example and a model for protective action. The combination of clear policy knowledge, a commitment to continuity of care, and the moral courage to physically interpose themselves became a blueprint discussed in continuing education courses and organizational guidance. The public ripples were broad. Health systems across the country asked legal counsel and risk management teams to review their coordination with local and federal enforcement authorities. Training modules on sensitive locations, what they are and how to protect them, spread from hospital mandatory sessions to national conferences. The video that had gone viral was now being used as a teaching tool. Nurses who once hesitated to speak publicly about internal incidents began, in greater numbers, to assert that protecting colleagues is protecting patients. For Jerome, the verdict brought complex closure. Financial damages allowed him additional security after months of uncertainty. They also gave him the means to invest in causes he cared about. With counsel's guidance, he allocated a portion of the award to a legal defense fund for healthcare workers and to training programs designed to help clinical teams navigate encounters with law enforcement without jeopardizing patient safety. He spoke at a national nursing conference, not as a grievance bearer alone, but as a witness to collective action, stating, in public rooms full of scrubs and name tags, that the nurses who formed the human wall had not only protected him, but had preserved the integrity of care. In the unit where the incident had occurred, the scene left a lasting mark. Colleagues organized a small plaque that now hangs near the nurses' station, a modest metal plate that reads in plain language about the day staff protected a colleague and preserved patient care. The plaque is not an honorific for a single individual. Its text explicitly recognizes the collective action. The charge nurse, the attending physician, security staff, and every nurse who stood shoulder to shoulder. It is meant to be a reminder. In moments of procedural uncertainty, frontline workers may be compelled by duty and compassion to act. Jerome returned to his unit. He resumed his shifts with the same steady hands colleagues had praised years before. He still carried the weight of those minutes. He still spoke, when interviewed, about the lingering anxiety that followed. But he also spoke about gratitude and purpose. He used his platform to advocate for clearer guidelines that protect both patient care and worker rights. He contributed to training sessions at the hospital where staff practiced scenarios of outside presence with a focus on de-escalation, documentation, and legal consultation. His presence on the unit after the trial was both a personal recovery and a public statement. The ICU had saved one of its own, and that saving had consequences beyond a single shift. Not all the outcomes were tidy. Legal observers cautioned against viewing the verdict as a cure-all. The case was powerful because of the surveillance footage and the particular facts of the operation. Courts in other cases, absent such vivid documentation, might not reach the same result. Some critics argued the agency's remedial steps were reactive. Others said that disciplinary actions should have been swifter. The plaintiff's team and civil rights advocates acknowledged those limits, emphasizing that one verdict is rarely sufficient to overhaul national practice, though it can create a precedent and a momentum. Yet the case did affect tangible changes. The agency's new verification rules were instituted in the region, and in some documented instances, cited in nationwide guidance. Hospital systems revised training modules and incident reporting protocols to ensure that encounters in sensitive locations were escalated immediately to legal counsel. Professional nursing groups published position statements underscoring the obligation to protect patients and to resist removals that would jeopardize care without judicial authorization. Those reforms, documented in policy updates and organizational memos, made the ICU incident a catalyst for institutional reflection and change. Perhaps most enduring was the narrative of workplace solidarity that the footage made plain. Nursing conferences replayed the video not to celebrate confrontation, but to showcase how collective professional judgment and courage can uphold standards of care in the face of outside pressure. The story entered curricula as an ethical case study. It was now a way to teach new nurses about the obligations of the profession and the practical mechanics of protecting patients and colleagues. For many who watched the footage and later the courtroom clips, the image of scrubs linking together became shorthand for what colleagues can concretely do when policies and procedures are ambiguous. In community forums and op-eds, the conversation broadened. Journalists and legal commentators parsed the line between administrative and judicial authority. Activists discussed how enforcement agencies interact with everyday institutions. Healthcare workers debated the balance between deference to law enforcement and the imperative to maintain clinical stability for vulnerable patients. These public debates were not purely academic. They resulted in legislative staffers requesting briefings and in municipal leaders asking hospitals and federal partners to clarify how operations in sensitive locations should proceed. Meanwhile, for the nurses who had stood that day, Patricia Reeves, Dr. Helena Kim, and the others, the public spotlight was uncomfortable but meaningful. They emphasized their motivations in interviews and at the trial. Not an act of defiance for its own sake, but a defense of patience and a practice of care. The narrative they insisted upon was steady and sober. When a caregiver is taken from a critical unit, lives can be endangered. That rationale, grounded in bedside realities, resonated with jurors, with viewers, and with colleagues across professions. As the dust settled, the core lesson of the incident remained tightly connected to the title that drew attention in the first place. Courageous nurses stood up for a Black Haitian-American ICU nurse when federal agents arrived claiming a name in a database, and that solidarity changed outcomes. It changed immediate outcomes. Jerome remained at his post. His patients continued to receive uninterrupted care, and it changed institutional outcomes. It generated greater accountability, led to documented procedural updates within the enforcement agency, and inspired hospitals and nursing organizations to refine their protections for sensitive spaces. The recorded footage had been the hinge. Courage had been the lever. The story does not end with a plaque or a headline. The legal victory and the policy updates are important, but the deeper legacy is cultural, a reinforced sense that healthcare workers can, when necessary, place the welfare of patients above deference to external authority, and that recorded public evidence can convert an isolated act of protection into a systemic correction. Jerome's settlement enabled him to create support systems for colleagues and to seed training programs that teach how to document, report, and, when ethically required, protect. The plaque on the nurse's station now draws quiet looks and conversation from new hires who are told, as part of orientation, what happened there and why it matters. When asked what he wanted the public to understand, Jerome returned, in testimony and interviews, to the simple vocation that had first brought him to nursing. "I've dedicated my career to saving lives," he said, paraphrased in court and in the press. "If my colleagues hadn't protected me, I would have been detained, maybe deported." That sentence is both personal and emblematic. It links individual vulnerability to broader structural stakes, how a name in a database can imperil a life built on service, and how communal action can restore some measure of justice. The human wall that day, small, ordinary, immediate, became, through recording and litigation, a lever for accountability. It forced questions about verification procedures and the prudence of enforcement actions in sensitive locations. It required institutions on all sides to reckon with the practical reality that patient care, once interrupted, carries risks that transcend bureaucratic convenience. It turned an hour of moral clarity in an ICU into a broader conversation about rights, responsibilities, and the limits of power. The plaque is quiet. The courtroom is filled with echoes. The training rooms hum with simulations. And in a unit where alarms pulse and hands are steady, Jerome works his shift, badge pinned, passport on file, continuing the vocation that nearly fell apart in a breathless moment, but was saved by colleagues who chose to stand in the doorway and make a line that could not be crossed. If this story mattered to you, leave a comment below. Would you have stood with them? Share this video to amplify the lesson that workplace solidarity can protect both people and principles. If you want to support workers facing similar crises, consider contributing to verified legal defense funds or advocacy groups that assist healthcare professionals in sensitive situations, and check sources to ensure your support goes to organizations with a proven track record.